Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're just going to give folks a couple more minutes to jump on here. So we'll get started here in just a minute. All right, welcome everyone to our first of a couple of webinar series. My name is Melissa Rary. I am a facilitator for the Colorado Wildlife and Transportation Alliance. We're really excited to welcome you today to our first webinar in our partnerships and tools to address Colorado wildlife vehicle collisions. In this webinar, we'll focus on our Alliance success stories and lessons learned. We're really excited, just a couple of technology notes for folks that we do have the chat open. That's where we'll be looking and fielding questions, capturing questions for our panelists at the end of the webinar. So do feel free to use the chat to engage with our panelists. We'll also be monitoring those and bringing those questions to our panel discussion towards the end of the webinar. We do have a quick poll just to see quickly who's in the room. I'm going to open this. It'd be great if you all could quickly let us know where you're from and what work you do. That way we can more target our presentation. So I'm going to open this now and give folks just a minute or two to respond. All right, just 30 more seconds. Awesome. Thanks so much. So just to quickly share the results of who's here, you can see we've got a number of folks from the Rocky Mountain West, but also some great representation from other parts of the US. And same with our primary field of work. Local, state, and federal agencies make up the majority, but at the same time, we still have a number of other groups here for our conversation today. Awesome. Quickly walk through the agenda with you all just so you know what to expect. We'll present some background information here at the beginning. We'll have some folks presenting why the Alliance got started and what the Alliance does. And then we'll go into our case studies where we really get into how the Alliance has used partnerships to move the needle on some of the goals that we've established. So we'll talk about on the ground partnerships, a partnership specifically at a project that is starting construction in the southern part of Colorado on US 160. We'll talk about our education and outreach efforts and how we've partnered with schools to educate around wildlife and transportation issues. And then our third case study will focus on a partnership around local planning and using both our state and local agencies to plan for wildlife migrations and mitigation in Colorado. With that, I will turn it over to my colleague Andy with Colorado Parks and Wildlife, and he'll get us kicked off talking about the need for this collaborative partnership.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Andy Holland, the statewide big game manager for Colorado Parks and Wildlife. You can move slides, Melissa. I'm just going to give a very brief background on the biological and human safety needs, as well as the sort of the backstory on the Wildlife Transportation Alliance before I turn it over to Tabor. So all animals move to access resources and different habitat types. For example, even in the summer, just to access water and forage. Animals migrate seasonally. Migration is a seasonal movement. And in Colorado, in the mountains of Colorado, that means migrating down in the fall to avoid deep snows in winter. And then in the spring, migrating back up into the mountains to capitalize on abundant and nutritious forage in the mountains after all that snow melt. Maintaining connectivity between these seasonal ranges is necessary for survival. It's not just a luxury. Wildlife crossing structures are important for protecting humans and wildlife during both movements, daily movements and seasonal migration. And aside from the obvious human safety issues, there's, I think about this as just stress when you're driving. I mean, we all know those places where it's not a pleasant drive because of animals on the roads. And in addition to that, we estimate in Colorado the cost of wildlife vehicle collisions in terms of damage to vehicles is 66 million just in Colorado alone. And as far as wildlife mortality, our estimates for mule deer on the western slope are 2% of our radio-collared does on the west slope are killed annually in wildlife vehicle collisions. And for perspective, that's in most of these herds, all but a couple, that's in excess to what we actually harvest with hunter harvest on does, which of course are the important segment for population growth and recovery. So the first thing I want to lay the groundwork on a little bit is this Colorado Parks and Wildlife and Colorado Department of Transportation partnership that we've been developing. We have very different missions. However, these missions intersect when and where wildlife crossroads. And because of that, our missions intersect there with safe passage of humans and wildlife on those highways. I'll just give a few examples of how increased collaboration benefits us and wildlife. One would be highway fencing. CDOT is required to fence the highway right-of-way with the type of fence requested by the landowner. However, some of these fence types, such as woven wire, are not wildlife friendly and can prevent, for example, calves and fawns from migrating back in the spring during the migration. They can't cross these type of fences. And so increased collaboration with CDOT allows them to bring us in to consult with that landowner and maybe find another more wildlife friendly fencing solution. Another example would be vegetation clearing. We can make recommendations on where CDOT should clear vegetation on right-of-ways so that animals are more visible before they're actually on the highway. And proactive planning is another important place for this, for our increased collaboration. Not every CDOT employee understands the need for migration and animal movement. And not every Parks and Wildlife employee understands that CDOT operates on a 10 to 20 year planning horizon. That we don't operate on the planning horizon that CDOT does. We're on more of an annual cycle. And so by proactively integrating wildlife crossings into transportation plans, we actually can get that in the planning process early on, rather than reactively commenting on the effects that those projects would have on wildlife at a later date when it may actually be too late to implement wildlife mitigation, excuse me. Go ahead and move on to the next slide, Melissa. And so crossing, another aspect of this is the location of crossing structures. And I'm going to show a few maps that demonstrate this, but by increasing our collaboration, we can implement more effective crossing structure locations. Essentially, the key to these is placing them where animals already want to cross. And I have a series of maps to just sort of demonstrate this point, and it'll spare you my repertoire of where did the mule deer cross the road jokes. This first one is from the perspective, oh, go back, can you go back one, Melissa? This first one is from the perspective of either a motorist or Colorado Department of Transportation. And this is where our deer collision carcasses are picked up. And you can see the red areas have high collision and the lighter colored areas are lower collisions. And this area is in Southwest Colorado between Durango and Pagosa. You can see Bayfield on the left there. I won't go into a lot of details on this because you're going to hear about this from Aaron Johnson, the Southern Ute tribal biologist, here in a moment in detail. But I wanted to show you this as just an example. So if you can go to the next one, Melissa. And these slides are from Aaron Johnson. He was gracious enough to make these for me. So this slide is from the perspective of a biologist or mule deer migration. And this shows from GPS color data the corridors and migration pinch points and bottlenecks. And then if you can go one more slide. And then this would be what an integrated approach looks like, where you can see that the high collision places with CDOT vehicle collision data, they pretty much overlap with mule deer migration data. So this is what more of an integrated approach looks like. And Aaron's going to talk more about this, but I just wanted to demonstrate this point. And I will, as an aside, if you look over on the left by Bayfield, I wanted to give a note on sample size and sampling. You can see that there's high collisions over on the left, but no wildlife migrations. That's just because we had not sampled that area. If we put collars in that area, of course, we would see the same thing as the other parts of the map. So you have to be careful not to get laser focused in on just what the map shows. And then go ahead to the next one. Then my final slide, I just wanted to give a little bit of background on how we got here. The West Slope Mule Deer Strategy was a project that Colorado Parks and Wildlife took on in 2012 and completed in 2014. And that was a public stakeholder process to address declining mule deer populations on the Western Slope. And it had 7 strategic priorities, the 4th of which was reduce impacts of highways on mule deer survival, movement, and migration. And we were attempting to address that priority with enhanced coordination with Colorado Department of Transportation, identify and prioritize highway stretches for wildlife mitigation, and prioritize crossing structures in our planning. And the second one there is that Highway 9 project, which is the first wildlife overpasses in the state of Colorado. We're really excited about that. There will be a lot more on that later, so I'm not going to talk about that in detail. The third is the West Slope Prioritization Study, and that is to identify and prioritize highway stretches for wildlife mitigation. And Tony Cady is going to talk about that a little bit later today, and the whole second webinar in this series is on that. So I just wanted to introduce that, and really it's a wildlife vehicle collision mitigation and habitat connectivity planning tool. And then the fourth bullet there is the Wildlife Transportation Summit that we put on in coordination with CDOT. And that was really to keep momentum from those earlier efforts and to bring not only CDOT and CPW into the same place, but also community leaders, local governments, and lawmakers to address this issue and make sure everybody understands the importance of this issue. And with that leads us up to today and the Wildlife Transportation Alliance. And I'll turn it over to Tabor Ward, and she can take it from there.
Hi, everybody. My name is Tabor Ward. I also work with CDR Associates, and we've been facilitating the Alliance since its inception, since 2017. So here's our mission: to provide safe passage for people and wildlife in Colorado. We just finished our strategic planning for the upcoming 2021 for the next 5 years, and we've really identified about 4 strong goals for the Alliance to come together, which include providing a collaborative forum. So we really want to be a forum that shares ideas, that strengthens each other, where we can bring everyone to the table to talk about these issues. And we're doing a lot of cross-agency, private-public collaboration. We also are focused on advancing on-the-ground priorities. So really looking at this at the state from a statewide perspective and looking at the West Slope, the East Slope, and confirming top implementation priorities, ensuring project readiness, building buy-in, and advocating for priority projects to make sure that we're speaking with one voice statewide to get projects on the ground moving forward. We're in the midst of developing a robust funding strategy, and this will support the Alliance itself, as well as helping to, again, implement on-the-ground mitigation priorities and projects, and help really change the funding paradigm. So we're not patchworking funds together for project by project, but that these, as Andy stated, are a priority from the inception of projects with the landowner, with the State Department of Transportation. And finally, really to provide a coordination point between federal, state, and local planning and policy efforts. So we want to support these federal initiatives and deliverables in a strategic and aligned way, as well as supporting our state initiatives and deliverables, and again, ensuring local project readiness. So those are really the four big themes of the Alliance coming up in the next few years. In addition to these internal themes, we've been working hard since 2017 to come together as a group. And so you can go to the next slide, Melissa. Just before we move forward, here's a list of our members. So it's not just CDOT and CPW. We have GOCO involved. We have the U.S. Forest Service, Federal Fish and Wildlife Service, Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, the Mule Deer Foundation. So we really are a robust group of public, private, and nonprofit entities that have come together to work and really make this happen from a statewide level. Next slide, please. So some of our achievements since 2017, project funding, we've raised over $500,000 to both support the Alliance and our outreach activities, but as well as to move forward on the ground projects, including fencing and other mitigation related projects. And that's really important to us to continue to help fund these projects and make sure that they move forward. We are a statewide voice, so we've presented at different conferences. We've gone to the Denver Sustainability Summit. We're trying to raise the visibility of the Alliance and this issue to the general public, and also areas where this is a priority. Developing partners, we're still trying to flesh out how our partnership development looks like and what our role is in terms of internal and external partnerships. And then interagency agreements and coordination. This is a big part of what we want to do. So this becomes institutionalized in the state of Colorado. And again, it's not just something that we're trying to fit together on a project by project basis, but we have something to rely on in terms of how this is going to move forward in the state in a cohesive, a comprehensive way to make sure that we get projects in place and help support our herds, our landowners, and safety in Colorado. So I'll pass the presentation on to our next speaker.
Awesome, thanks Tabor. And with that, we'll get into our 3 case studies to talk a little bit more in detail about the Alliance accomplishments and what this collaborative effort means. So Aaron, please go ahead.
Great, well, good morning or good afternoon to everybody, depending on where you're tuning in from. I want to just start by giving a shout out to the Alliance for putting the webinar together, and of course for bringing all of us together to talk and share discussion on this topic. My name is Aaron Johnson. I'm the wildlife biologist for the Southern Ute Indian Tribe. We're located here in Southwest Colorado, snowy Southwest Colorado today. So this morning, I'm happy to have a few minutes to talk to you about the US Highway 160, State Highway 151 Wildlife Crossings project. Keep in mind that this project is just breaking ground this month. And so my purpose today is to give you some of the backstory. Go ahead to the next slide. The Highway 160 project is located in Southwest Colorado, as I said, in Archuleta County, west of Pagosa Springs. The Highway 160 corridor runs east-west through the middle of the slide. And looking at the project area in yellow, notice the land status of the surrounding country. There's United States Forest Service land to the north and Southern Ute tribal land to the south. You can see the exterior boundary of the reservation represented by the dashed line and where US Highway 160 briefly dips into Indian country, crossing into the reservation near the project area. And I'll get more into tribal involvement in this project, but first I can speak a little bit to how the project began. Next slide, please. This project didn't start as a wildlife mitigation project. Rather, it has gone through an evolution to its current form. It initially began as a CDOT highway safety improvement project focused on extending a passing lane and addressing other highway safety issues. After further investigating wildlife vehicle collisions, considering site-specific migration data, and fostering interagency partnering opportunities, the project began developing into its current form as a major wildlife mitigation project. This slide gives an idea of the scale of wildlife vehicle collisions along the project stretch. About 60% of accidents on that section of roadway involve wildlife. A quick look at this graphic shows that these collisions primarily involve mule deer and elk. Vehicle accidents and animal carcasses along the highway will always get CDOT and public attention, but understanding why the animals are crossing at a location is also a valuable piece of the puzzle. Next slide, please. I've been studying ungulate movement and migration in and out of the reservation since about 2004. How and when mule deer and elk seasonally cross in and out of the reservation, as well as identifying the obstacles they face, is very important information for the tribe. GPS radio collars have revolutionized how we see our data, and modeling techniques allow us to project how entire herds move across the landscape. But in this case, I'm simply going to show you where animals have crossed the road in our project area. Again, keep in mind that this project is currently only in the earliest stages of being built. So what I'll be showing you is pre-construction data overlaying what will be installed later this year. And so the current look at the slide there, you can see it's just zooming down on the project area. You can see where the underpass will be, the overpass, the overpass and the exclusion fencing. Of course, there will be other elements like jump outs and gates and things like that, but just to keep it simple. So next slide. These gray lines represent where radio collared elk moved across the US Highway 160 project area between 2013 and 2017. Next. And the blue lines represent where radio collared mule deer moved across the project area between 2005 and 2008. And so these are seasonal movements, migrations, as Andy pointed out, and they're made in the spring and in the fall. In total, this represents about 100 highway crossings by around 50 animals. So referencing these types of data and working with the surrounding topography, we feel very good about the placement of these structures. I need to add that while we have all this great on the ground data, and it's certainly added to the validity of the project likely wouldn't have passed muster without the results of the West Slope Wildlife Prioritization Study, which indeed highlighted this location as a priority for wildlife mitigation in CDOT Region 5. Next slide. Perhaps to this point in my presentation, it hasn't been clear, but the Highway 160 project represents the collaborative efforts of three primary partners. The Colorado Department of Transportation is understandably the primary mover and shaker with this project, as US and state highways within Colorado are their maintenance and safety responsibility. As I've mentioned, the initial push for this project came from CDOT, albeit in a little different form. The Southern Ute Indian tribe came to the table early on and provided first big game migration and movement data that validated wildlife vehicle collision information for the project area. And secondly, we came with a plan to contribute funding to the project. Colorado Parks and Wildlife has been on board from the start as well, and their interest is inherent. In our region, in many cases, wildlife resources are shared resources between the state and the tribe. Mule deer and elk are a great example. Our agencies often communicate and collaborate on projects that will benefit these resources, and this is one of those projects. Fortunately, as partners, the tribe and CPW were able to commit substantial enough funds to push the effort over the edge for CDOT support and funding of the remainder of the project. And let's be clear, CDOT is footing much of the bill. Next slide, please. But funding has come from other sources as well. The Colorado Wildlife and Transportation Alliance has been instrumental in assisting with identifying and securing additional funding through outside grant programs such as NIFWIF and RMEF. NIFWIF, the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, administers funding for the Secretarial Order 3362, improving habitat quality in Western big game winter range and migration corridors. This project checked all the right boxes for SO 3362, for the SO 3362 program, and was approved for $375,000 in funding. Likewise, Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation saw the utility of the project for assisting not just elk, but many other species in navigating safely across US Highway 160, and they approved $75,000 in funding. What this means to us is that the Alliance assisted with bringing nearly $500,000 to this project. And while these types of infrastructure projects are exceedingly expensive, that is meaningful amounts of money. Next slide. And so why is the Southern Ute Indian tribe involved? The tribe maintains strong cultural ties to many wildlife species, including mule deer and elk. Traditional knowledge paired with modern wildlife research tells us the story of how animals move across the landscape to complete their annual cycles. The image you're looking at shows the results of a migration corridor mapping exercise using about 40 elk that we radio collared on tribal lands between 2013 and 2017. To give you the lay of the land, this corridor runs north and south between federal public lands, namely US Forest Service, including designated wilderness, and Southern Ute tribal lands. Elk migrations can be as short as a handful of miles and as long as 65 miles traveling up and over the Continental Divide into the upper Rio Grande drainage. And of course, these movements are made twice per year, in the spring and in the fall. It's important culturally, socially, and ecologically that species like mule deer and elk can return to tribal lands as unencumbered as possible. Hunting is important for some, harvesting meat with extended family and sacred places, but to others, the simple presence of animals in traditional areas at traditional times is also deeply meaningful. The San Juan mule deer and elk herds in Southwest Colorado face many challenges across the extent of their range. In general, the San Juan herd boundary runs from the Animas River Valley on the west to the Continental Divide east of Pagosa Springs. It encompasses the high San Juans, some of the last great remote country in Colorado, and runs down through the reservation to the New Mexico state line. There are about 84 miles of Highway 160 that bisect the range of the San Juan mule deer and elk herds. The highway only crosses into the Southern Ute Indian Reservation for about 7 miles. That 7-mile stretch represents a critically important link to maintaining connectivity for the animals between seasonal ranges on federal public lands and tribal lands, and maintaining cultural connections for the Southern Ute people. As a quick aside, before I leave this slide, notice how much of the highway crossing for these elks is concentrated in the project area, the intersection of US Highway 160 and State Highway 151. Next slide. And this is my last one. So this final slide shows a few scenes of elk and mule deer moving through migration bottlenecks that we have mapped over the years. These animals have either just left tribal lands and crossed Highway 160 in the spring, or are on approach to crossing the highway and accessing tribal lands in the fall. I've been with the Southern Ute Indian tribe for 18 years. And for many of those years, I've had this project on my mind in one way or another. After our first mule deer migration models showed the Highway 160 crossing near Lake Capote, I've always wondered, what if? And now, many years later, with increased knowledge and interagency communication, as well as collaboration with the Colorado Wildlife and Transportation Alliance, here we are. I'm proud to be able to demonstrate tribal involvement in the lead up to the project. It's been a pleasure to participate in discussions on design of the project, and I am really looking forward to contributing time and effort on post-construction research to understand how the crossing structures and other design elements are working. And so that's all I have for you this morning. Again, I appreciate being here and want to thank the Alliance and thank all of you for spending your time with us this morning.
Awesome. Thank you, Aaron. And while we move on to our next speaker, I just wanted to note we do have some questions in the chat. We'll be getting to those at the end when we bring all of our panelists back. So if you have questions, feel free to pop them into the chat. Our team is capturing them and we'll be happy to answer. And with that, I'll turn it over to Heather.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Heather Hubbard. I'm the statewide education coordinator with Colorado Parks and Wildlife, and I'm really excited to be able to represent the education outreach technical team today and share some of the work that we've been doing as a team. Go ahead and move slides, Melissa. So within this team, we have a number of people that sit in different realms. So me and some colleagues from Colorado Parks and Wildlife make up this team, including people from the Department of Transportation and also ARC Solution. And together, we've really looked at to see where we want to go when it comes to formal education resources and how we can provide that not only to teachers, but to field staff that may be going in to do guest speaking engagements with students, and also other organizations that may be working with schools and students that would like to look at this type of issue that's happening in their community. So as we got started, partnerships was a really big part for us in order to really understand what was already out there and some of the journeys that other states have gone through as they've been working on this. One of those was a collaboration that ARC Solution had with Montana State University, where they were able to work with teachers in order to learn from subject matter experts and then develop curriculum that was being used in the classroom. So we had the opportunity to talk with them, see what they were doing, and get some feedback and some understanding of what worked and what advice they had for us as we thought about what we wanted to create. We've also, as we've been working on this, started reaching out and finding more people, even here in the state of Colorado, that have been working on these types of curriculums. So really understanding the work that's been happening in other states and our own to see how we could fill gaps with the content that we were creating. As I said, one of our goals was really to think about how we added these activities to the set that may already be out there from that K-12 audience perspective that could be used by field staff, other environmental education providers or organizations, and including our teachers. Go ahead and switch to the next slide. So a subgroup of us started working on a couple of activities. And in the subgroup, we really looked to see how we could bring in different subject matter experts that had been involved in this work here in Colorado, because we really wanted to make sure that the content we were creating had connections to what was happening in the real world, the processes that came about when we start talking about crossing structures and how that goes into communities. And providing kind of a simulation feeling for them to understand what it looks like in the work that's happening and how much is involved. It's a complex process and project that's happening when these crossings are being looked at and developed. Our subject matter experts on these first two activities included regional education coordinators, wildlife biologists, land use specialists, and our energy liaison and land use coordinators. All of them have been participating and working in projects in the state. And so they were able to really help us think about what does this look like in real life? And that's where these were born. With these two activities, we really liked some of what Project Wild was doing. And so we talked with the director at the national level to see if we could use some of their work as a baseline and then look at how we would create more of a specific Colorado curriculum surrounding those. And so these are based off of two Project Wild activities that we then restructured and put together based on what we do here. The first one is connecting wildlife and connecting communities. All of these are based off of a guiding question that's a large scale questions that really are utilized to get kids to think. So how do we balance the needs of humans and wildlife and land use and transportation planning? This activity gets students to role play and think through what a public meeting looks like and how information is brought from the Department of Transportation and Colorado Parks and Wildlife, but also how other stakeholders in those communities are bringing their concerns, their needs, the issues, in order to get that bigger picture of what's the right solution. So through this type of activity, they're going through role playing to have a better understanding of all stakeholders' perspectives and needs and how that relates to the work then that we're doing with land use and the needs of our wildlife. The second one that we've worked on is called movement barriers. This one is really looking at management options and having an understanding of there's not one solution, it's a combination of solutions. But how do you take information, the data that's collected by Department of Transportation and Colorado Parks and Wildlife? How do you take the structure of the road, the needs of the community, and how do you design and develop and think through what is the best management options? So these are really designed to have kids think critically about all of the information in order to come up with a solution. And then they're able to see how it all played out in with Highway 9 and what actually was involved in creating those as a solution as well. Next slide. This work is just starting. We have 2 activities right now, but we have a lot of next steps that we're excited to get to. These activities we're getting out into classrooms right now, and we're piloting them to see how it works. These are geared more towards middle school, high school levels. So we have some classrooms across the state that are testing this out and providing feedback so we can see how to better improve these for a teacher's perspective. And then we're also looking at how we can add more. The goal is to be able to group a number of these activities into a full curriculum set that really spans the work from beginning to end when we look at crossing structures. We've also been talking to different partner organizations that have been doing some work and seeing how we may connect with some of the things that they're doing. An example would be University Center for Atmospheric Research is doing work with middle school students on the development of sensors and using 3D printers. And so we've talked about how this lesson may be something that they could couple with what they're already doing, and students using sensors to develop a data set in order to create feedback on where a crossing could go, or using a 3D printer in those projects in order to create their model of what a crossing could look like as they're working through this. So really looking at how can we expand and connect more and collaborate with other partners and people that are doing some similar ideas and work out there. I think that's, kind of where we're at for now. I'm going to go ahead and pass it on to the next person. I know we're short on time, but as we move through it, we're really excited. The work that we're doing so far, we've heard that students are loving it. They're engaged. It's a great way for them to take on much more of that real world aspect of that work. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Heather. And thanks so much for your team's work on this in collaboration with the Alliance. Our next speaker is Tony Cady with the Colorado Department of Transportation.
Good morning. My name is Tony Cady, as Melissa just mentioned, and I'm the Planning and Environmental Manager for Region 5 of the Colorado Department of Transportation. As we've stated, we're discussing several partnership projects that the Colorado Wildlife and Transportation Alliance has been involved with and has assisted on across the state. Andy briefly mentioned the close partnering efforts that CDOT and CPW have engaged in to address wildlife vehicle collisions and habitat connectivity across the state. Aaron discussed the fantastic partnership between CDOT, the Southern Ute Indian Tribe, and CPW on the US 160 highway project by Pagosa Springs. And I wanted to take a few minutes and highlight a pilot project that we're working on with La Plata County. So next slide. All right, so this pilot project is an example of how state agencies and any other wildlife mitigation project proponent needs to engage with local land use planners and their planning commissions to address land use planning practices that help ensure the success and the long-term viability of our wildlife crossing structures. With the simple premise being that when we invest more than $1 million to build a single crossing structure with a lifespan of 75 to 100 years, we need to ensure the long-term viability and the usefulness of that structure by wildlife. Next slide. And to do that, we need to make every effort to ensure that the outlets of these critical crossing structures look more like the picture on the left and not at all like the picture on the right. Next slide. So as Andy mentioned in later webinars, we're going to go into a great detail about how the locations for wildlife mitigation projects are determined, the data we utilize to drive our decision-making process. Some of that is depicted on this graphic here, and then how these elements are funded and then implemented on the ground. But for today, I'll just simply state that CDOT has committed to constructing 21 wildlife underpasses on US Highway 160 between the towns of Durango and Bayfield, and 9 wildlife underpasses on US 550 between Durango and the New Mexico state line. Both of these corridors are situated in La Plata County, Colorado. These are mitigation commitments from the US 160 Durango to Bayfield Environmental Impact Statement, which was finalized in 2006, and the US 550 Environmental Assessment, which was completed in 2005. We've been constructing improvements to both of these corridors in phases as funding has become available. and we've already installed several crossing structures per the EIS and EA recommendations. And we're also currently working on the design for 2 additional phases on these corridors, which would then construct 3 additional underpass structures, hopefully within the next 10 years or so, depending on funding availability. CDOT focuses our efforts to reduce the number of wildlife vehicle collisions that are seen on our very busy roadways. These 2 highways are the busiest roads in Southwest Colorado, and they have accident rates with 60 to 70% of all the crashes being wildlife vehicle collisions. And then we're also really focused on mitigating for the ecological impact that our roads have on the natural environment. And then CPW has been heavily engaged in the development of both of these corridor projects, with their primary interest being to preserve the wildlife populations in La Plata County by reducing wildlife vehicle collisions, but also really focusing on helping to ensure that these animals have access to habitats that are critical for their survival. Next slide. So the concept of the MOU is really simple, but it's often the simplest ideas that turn into the most challenging things to implement on the ground. However, the pilot MOU will establish an agreement with the La Plata County Planning Commission to partner with CDOT and CPW on any development proposal that are situated near proposed wildlife underpasses on the state highway system or adjacent to mapped wildlife movement corridors within the county. Under the MOU, the county would promulgate restrictions as conditions of the development permit process. And as always, development restrictions on private property is a very controversial issue. And just the concept of this type of an agreement has the potential to become very politicized. So we're approaching this very carefully and recognizing that private lands and private property owners have rights, and we're not trying to infringe or impinge those rights. So the development of the restrictions or recommendations would include the requirement that open space be planned into the development to preserve the integrity of the landscape immediately adjacent to the plant crossing structures. So this graphic shows 3 wildlife underpass structures on US 160, 2 planned and 1 that's already been built. The green polygons around the 2 crossing structures on the right side of the graphic are planned to be built in the next 10 years. And the green polygons would show or represent that open space requirement for the development permit application. And then second, the county could require development setbacks to provide buffers for movement corridors that will allow animals to move from the underpass structures and then easily access essential summer and winter range or other critical habitats. And then that polygon is represented in blue, and would provide a means for animals to move from the underpass structure and access those habitats that are critical for their survival. Just to note, we do make every effort to try to situate these underpass structures so that they're adjacent to publicly owned lands. And an example of that is the underpass on the left side of this graphic. This was built several years ago, and it was the first that was built in this corridor because it was situated immediately adjacent to tracts of land owned by the Bureau of Land Management. But animals don't always move in the areas that we would prefer, and that's not often possible when we're designing these structures to situate them appropriately adjacent to public lands. So next slide. So the MOU process, while not complete, has been an initiative that the county has been interested in for decades. La Plata County has a history of having fairly progressive planning ideals, and there are already numerous provisions for wildlife written into the La Plata County codes. This slide shows some examples of those provisions which we're leveraging for this pilot MOU process. Next slide. So in addition to the open space and setback requirements proposal, La Plata County is also focusing on conducting development permit review and approvals while fully considering adjacent land uses to help ensure wildlife movements through the county. And then they're also looking to address high rates of wildlife vehicle collisions on both county roads and other road networks in their zoning districts. And then last slide. So they're also working with landowners to appropriately fence property boundaries to minimize impacts to wildlife. And this will take the form of permit recommendations on fencing types and layouts to ensure that fencing is wildlife friendly and that does not obstruct wildlife movement. And those recommendations would be made in collaboration with Colorado Parks and Wildlife. And then last slide. So once the pilot process, MOU process has been completed and the final MOU has been accepted by the Planning Commission, we'll be reaching out to other counties across the state to develop similar MOUs with their agencies with the goal of protecting all of our wildlife crossing mitigation structures, and then also ensuring accessible wildlife movement corridors throughout the state. With the primary focus right now being on those areas that are under imminent threat of sprawl or new commercial or residential development, like the situation that's occurring on US 160 just east of Durango. The MOU is currently in its draft form. It's being reviewed by CDOT, CPW, and La Plata County Commission and their legal staff. Determinations are being made about the legalities of restricting development on private properties, how the enforcement of any development restrictions and wildlife best management practices would occur, and then what status the MOU partners would have in the development permit application review process. As we move forward with the pilot MOU, any updates on the project will be posted to the Colorado Wildlife and Transportation Alliance website. And then we'll be discussing it as appropriate in additional webinars hosted by this group. And that's it. Thanks, Melissa.
Awesome. Thanks, Tony. And I'm going to stop sharing here and ask all of our panelists to come back online so we can see you. I'll turn my camera on as well. And now, you know, as Tony mentioned, these were really just snippets and very short descriptions of things that the Alliance is working on. There are a number of other initiatives, partnerships out there. And also, as you can probably see that a lot of these are a lot more complex than the 10 minutes that we have to present them to you. So with that, I just want to open it up for Q&A with our panelists. And Erin, it looks like we have one question in the chat for you. I'm wondering if you maybe could discuss in a little bit more detail the disconnect, and I can bring back up the map if that's helpful, the disconnect between the straight line animal movement representations versus actual meandering animal movements. And there's a second part to that question, but maybe we'll cover that first and then go on to the second part.
Okay, yeah, I'll do my best. I think what the question might be referring to is kind of this idea of, you know, looking at a model versus kind of looking at the connect the dots, the lines that I showed on the Highway 160 crossing there. And maybe if you can sort of toggle between that and say the model a couple slides later, but so again, I think what the question is referring to is that, you know, when we talk about migrations, I typically always kind of want to make sure people understand that like these corridors are habitats. Very rarely is it, you know, are migrations on a straight line course. You know, they're not fast. They are meandering. They're moving around. So I think sometimes these straight line representations are either sort of estimates of where animals are moving. There's not really good on the ground data. Or they could be created using, you know, again, we've got these GPS radio collars and they're super, super accurate and they give us tons of great information, but it also depends on what the biologist is programming those collars to collect. So if you've got, you know, some folks really are just looking at survival and they're kind of interested in habitat use. So they might have locations separated by 12 hours. So if you've got that and you're seeing, you know, where an animal migrates to, it probably looks pretty straight line versus a biologist that's got two hours between locations or something like that. So again, you know, these models, I think they do a really good job of incorporating error, and they're sort of combining these large data sets. And you do see that sort of that sinuous meandering, which is really accurate. You know, an elk that's migrating 65 miles, they could cover that really quick, but they don't. You know, it depends a lot on the terrain they're going through and the snow melt, and so it takes them a month instead of they could run that in a few days. So anyway, that's a long answer. I know we don't have tons of time, but maybe in the chat, if the person has more they want me to follow up on, I can visit with them.
Perfect. And could you quickly talk, Aaron, about the second part of that question? Why are there not many animal movements shown in the Capote campground? And is that as a result of avoidance of humans? And
yeah,
try to get back
I don't believe so. I guess it's important. Again, these seasonal movements are in the fall and in the spring. The campground there is actually not, when these animals are moving through, the deer, like in the spring, well, the campground may be open. It's not very, it's not a big campground. There's not a lot of activity in there. And so, yeah, I don't really know. Could have a little bit to do with that, but in the fall when the animals are coming through, there's certainly nobody in that campground, and it's kind of questionable in the spring. So, I think that Highway 160, it's either the first big obstacle that they're coming to or the last, depending on what season they're moving through. And so I think sometimes after a little bit of kind of wandering around near the highway, they just cut and they get across there. So good question. I'm not sure that it has to do a lot with avoidance. There's not much there, actually.
Awesome. Thanks, Aaron. I'm going to stick with our more technical questions for now. I'm going to stop sharing again. And a question, Andy, for you. How was it that you calculated the annual cost of collisions?
So I might defer that. Because that's not my number. I know others on this steering committee have worked on those numbers. Probably CDOT and Julia Kinch are more involved. So I might have to actually defer that. I was just citing that their collision cost data. That came off the Transportation Alliance website.
Yeah, this is Tony. There is a national statistic that calculates the cost for two different types of accidents: a property damage only, which no fatalities occur, or an accident that has a fatality. And they've determined the cost through actuarial firms to determine how much it costs the society, all things factored into it. Property damage costs, medical costs, insurance costs, costs for road closures to deal with the accident, a huge number of factors that go into the cost. And they've determined how much it costs society for a single accident that just has property damage, an accident that has an injury, and an accident that has a fatality. And so we're able to take those costs and then look at our collision data with all the reported accidents across the state and determine the financial cost to motorists. In the next webinar series, we're going to talk about the West Slope Wildlife Prioritization Study. And one of the unique things that study did was incorporate into the analysis of the cost to our society for wildlife vehicle collisions a couple other factors, one being the loss of animal life. So there's a value to that life, both from hunting licenses and then just from a recreational wildlife viewing standpoint. And they were able to determine a cost for a single mule deer and a cost for a single elk. And then we've added that cost to the equation as well. And then we've also taken a look at, how much tourist economic revenue generation we get just from people wanting to come to Colorado to view our wonderful wildlife. And so we've been able to determine pretty close that the economic impact to Colorado is around $75 million annually from wildlife vehicle collisions.
One thing that I'll add to the cost that wasn't even mentioned is just, I sort of alluded to the stress to motorists, at least the ones that are aware. If you've ever driven that stretch of Highway 160 in the winter at night, you know that there's a serious psychological cost to driving that. It's the definition of white knuckle, because there's deer and elk all over the highway at night. And so that's not in here, but it's just an aside for those of us that care about wildlife and our vehicles. It's real in these places like 160 Aaron was talking about.
Thank you both for that. I want to shift a little bit to talking about the partnership and some of the collaborative efforts that we mentioned. Tony, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the initiation of the partnership, and maybe Andy as well, and whether it came from CDOT, CPW, or how that collaborative effort got started.
So the inception of the partnership, we've been working with CPW for decades, and it's typically been on a project by project basis. As we get funding for a project and we start the design of that project, we look at the data around what the needs are for the roadway. When we recognize that there's a safety issue on the highway and it's due to wildlife vehicle collisions, then we bring in CPW to start having a discussion about, what the needs are for addressing wildlife movements and reducing wildlife vehicle collisions. Andy mentioned in 2014, they came out with their West Slope Mule Deer strategy. That was a huge impetus for them to approach CDOT to enhance the partnership and start having more frequent conversations about how we could work together to collaborate and proactively determine needs on the highway instead of being reactive and then trying to find funding after a project's kind of been conceived and already designed. And that really led to the next webinar presentation, which is the West Slope Wildlife Prioritization Study. And the true goal of that study was to get CDOT and CPW on the same page about, proactively identifying and then prioritizing these wildlife mitigation structures based off of data, and two types of data. One, where we're seeing lots of mortality on the highway and addressing that. And then also maybe where we're not seeing mortality, but we know animals need to cross the road, and how do we facilitate that movement? So that's really increased the partnership that we have. I don't know if that question was specific to the Alliance itself, which, the Alliance really came out of that partnership that was developed through the creation of the West Slope Wildlife Prioritization Study. And we'll get into a lot of that detail in the next webinar. Or if it was about the La Plata County MOU. And I can't answer that question because we meet so frequently with CPW and we're talking about these issues all the time. As I mentioned on 160, we have an EIS that was, record of decision was signed in 2006. So we've been talking about these 21 wildlife crossing structures for decades. And the movement patterns change, the accident patterns change. And so we need to always readdress the locations of those sites to make sure that they're in the most opportune spots to facilitate crossing and to reduce wildlife vehicle collisions. So we've been meeting to talk about the intercept of wildlife movements in the highways, and then it's just naturally involved to a discussion about facilitating movement outside the roadway itself and making sure that the animals can connect to their summer and winter ranges. And that really is, that local land use planning piece where as a state agency, we don't have a lot of control of what happens outside of our right of way. And so it's really important for the state to engage with local land use planners to coordinate zoning and then development restrictions to facilitate the usefulness of our structures and then the ability of wildlife to access those habitats that are leading into and out of those structures.
And Tony, just to follow up on that really quick, there was a question here about community involvement. So you mentioned local planning. I'm curious if you could maybe talk about how does the community get involved in these projects, and what is the decision making like? Does the community have a seat at the table when it comes to final decision making?
Yeah, I think community involvement plays a huge role in how CDOT prioritizes and funds projects. There are 15 different transportation planning regions throughout Colorado, or throughout Region 5, sorry, 15 counties, 3 transportation planning regions in Region 5, 15 regions around the state. And we do encourage public involvement, and we talk about project needs. the public's involved when we do our long range planning efforts, and we seek community input on what their perceived needs are on the roadway. And we take those considerations, analyze the data, and determine whether that need is perceived or if it's a real need based off of factors like average annual daily traffic, the accident rate, what the types of accidents are. We also look at growth patterns across the state and try to analyze. The West Slope Wildlife Prioritization Study did a really great job at analyzing future growth patterns and the travel demand that will be created by that future growth. And then looking at the needs on the highway and specifically for wildlife vehicle collision mitigation reduction, and focusing on where we think travel patterns will shift in the future so that we're being proactive. So, the West Slope Wildlife Prioritization Study provides a really intensive data-driven decision-making process. So we know where animals are crossing, we know where wildlife are being hit on the roadway, and then we've identified kind of the worst of the worst. So we've identified the top 10% sites in the greatest need for mitigation, and then the top 20% sites, on and on. So we've been able to prioritize based off of data the need for wildlife mitigation structures across the West Slope. We're currently working on an East Slope and Plains study. And so hopefully by this time next year, we'll have a statewide prioritization model. But aside from that, if public comes and they have real concerns about a project area, we will take those concerns and look at the data to determine if it's, if it is a true issue or just a perceived issue. And then even if it's just a perceived issue, public support and public partnership can always drive the implementation of a project and raise it in the priority status for the DOT. So I would encourage public support. I would encourage members of the public to attend our transportation planning region meetings. And you can contact me or anyone at the DOT to get a schedule of those events and come and address your concerns to the DOT. We'll discuss those with CPW, and then we always respond to public comments. So we'll reply back to you with an answer to your question and maybe next steps on how we could further engage you in supporting that particular issue.
Awesome. Thanks, Tony. We have a number of questions coming in, so we're going to try to get to as many as possible in the next few minutes that we have with the panelists. Heather, a question for you is, have you been successful integrating wildlife connectivity with other subjects in K-12 environmental education programs?
It's a great question. As we started developing these activities, we wanted to make sure that we had really good connections with all content areas. Where we chose to focus is really looking at the connections not only with our science standards, but our social studies standards with that civic engagement component of it. So the two that we have currently have a really strong connection with our social studies standards. As far as like English language arts standards, we've really tackled in or kind of connected into the communication and the written components that we tend to find in those standards. And then for math, really having opportunities for things like data analysis and looking at some of the data to help understand some of the decision-making processes that are happening. So yeah, we're really working to make sure that it's not just a siloed, we only are looking at a science standard, but how are we incorporating all standards to show that how this is connected in the real world.
Awesome. Thanks so much. One question, Tony, for you again is about the zoning efforts. So a question about the zoning efforts to benefit the habitat on either side of a highway crossing. Have attempts been made with specific private landowners to determine if they would be interested in a conservation easement or a fee title?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's the first step in the process. When we work with the landowner, we're going to site a wildlife underpass. We reach out to that landowner to let them know that that's the proposed location for an underpass. And then we work with them to try to develop a conservation easement as the first step. So if we're unable to successfully develop the easement at the inlet and outlet or a migration route, then we're going to start working with the Planning Commission to develop restrictions on any future development that would happen on that property if it gets subdivided or rezoned. But the first step is always to discuss the conservation easement. We actually have a program at CDOT where when we're actively designing a project and we're looking to acquire rights of way for that project, we'll pay the landowner to have appraisals done and the up to $50,000 per landowner to determine the value of the conservation easement, and then to work with, in La Plata County, it's the La Plata County Open Space, to work with a third party who would manage that easement for the DOT and the private property owner. And then we work with them to determine what the tax benefit would be for the development of that conservation easement. So that is often the first step in the process. If we can't cite something immediately adjacent to public lands, we try to work with the landowner to get a conservation easement. It's, in lots of parts of the state, people don't necessarily want to lock their property up and restrict their potential for future development. So it's at that point that we start working with the counties to develop these proposals for open space and setbacks to allow us to ensure the viability of our structures.
Andy, I see your hand up. Is there something you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a couple of things to that first question, really to Tony's answer. I wanted to, in particular, give credit to CDOT for all the funding that they have provided to these efforts, like the West Slope prioritization and Summit and this alliance. They deserve a lot of credit for that, and also to Tony in particular. If you can't tell, he's taken this on both professionally and personally. And then the last thing I wanted to just add, and I didn't go into it in my presentation, but one of the pieces of understanding that I and I think other CPW people have come to appreciate as it relates to CDOT on this is how much these structures cost, how long the planning horizon is, and how tight some of the budgetary limitations are with CDOT. I think it's easy to look from the outside saying, why don't they just do this? And there's very real budgetary, financial and planning restrictions to just doing these in every project.
Thanks.
Awesome. A couple more questions coming through. So any thoughts on how CDOT could be more proactive in the collaborative process to incorporate wildlife mitigation before the proposal is fully developed, so that it is part of, I'm not going to read the whole context, but so that it's part of the proposal and not mitigation after the fact. So I think, Tony, really getting at how are we more proactive around thinking about wildlife mitigation on our roadways?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and it's something that we've had to learn our lessons over the course of a couple of decades, trying to find money to implement mitigation after the budget's already been set on a project. And those issues really led to that West Slope Wildlife Prioritization Study, and hopefully by this time next year we'll have a statewide prioritization study so that we're identifying those needs at the planning stage, as opposed to after planning and cost estimates have been developed for a project. So mitigation for habitat connectivity or wildlife vehicle collision reduction is baked into the project as part of the project need. So to address like working with other agencies and stakeholders, that comes through our long-range planning process. And as Andy mentioned, we have really long planning horizons. So we just wrapped up our 25-year long-range plan. So we're looking out 25 years and trying to find out how we would fund the improvements that we need within that horizon. To kind of address this specific issue, we've then tailored that down to a 10-year strategic pipeline of projects. So what projects we'd want to build in this 10-year horizon, and then really looking closely at the financing for all those projects and identifying the needs ahead of time before we physically create the project and start working on it. And we integrated the West Slope Wildlife Prioritization Study priorities into that 10-year pipeline. And it's been highly successful. So through the TPR meetings, we talked about wildlife mitigation. We had folks from Central Federal Lands, the Forest Service, and the BLM attend those meetings to talk about needs, to incorporate their comments and considerations into our planning process. And we collaboratively worked on developing the needs across the state. And as evidence of that success, we have 25 projects in the next 10 years that have wildlife mitigation components baked into the project need itself. So it's not a afterthought being added at the end when we've determined all of a sudden, oh, we have huge wildlife impacts on this corridor. We've identified those up front by utilizing this study, and those are part of the scope. So we're learning our lessons, we're making headway. I think we're improving our collaboration with our stakeholders and really focusing on data to drive the needs in the planning process as opposed to after.
Awesome. Thanks, Tony. I want to talk a little bit about the collaborative nature of the Alliance, and I'm wondering if each of you maybe could briefly touch on how has the Alliance enabled, how has this collaborative forum that the Alliance provides enabled each of these projects to be successful? And maybe Heather, I'll start with you and then we can go around the panel room.
I think from education outreach, technical team kind of aspect is we did start with a number of people on the team, but it's been much more of, it's like a snowball effect of how, as we work together, as we talk, as we learn more, how we start to reach out and we're able to collaborate and connect with other partners as we look at really what we're wanting to do and trying to find what some of the best resources are. So we may have started off a little bit small, but each person that came then had someone else or another organization that they knew was working on this, and we were able to then build connections there. And from that, it continued to grow. And so I think, you know, as we think about that collaborative piece, it's an ongoing process. It wasn't just this is it from the beginning and this is the only way it's going to look, but that it continually evolves as more people come to light and more people are interested in the work or doing the work, that we find those connections.
Awesome. Thanks, Heather. Tony, what about from your perspective in the MOU development?
So the Alliance has allowed, you know, all of the agencies that are stakeholders in that group to sit down and really hash out, you know, what our project priorities should be, both on the ground construction projects, but also showing the need across the state, and then providing kind of that voice that's outside of any one group. So it's not CDOT delivering a message, it's not CPW delivering a message, but it's a collaborative group of stakeholders that has both agency standpoints and non-governmental organization standpoints, voicing the concern across the state. And it's helped us to focus, putting pressure on projects to implement mitigation. And then as a group, we've applied for a number of grants. And that's probably been the most successful part of, you know, our collaboration with the Alliance is working together as a group to support a grant proposal, to put our weight behind a grant proposal. And then we've, you know, I think we've gotten 7 or 8 different grants to bring that last dollar financing to a project to allow it to actually happen. You know, Aaron provided a great example with the 151, 160 project, but we've also funded some pre-construction efforts across the state. We've funded a wildlife fencing project on US 24. We've worked with CPW to fund projects on I-25. I-70 just received a huge grant for wildlife mitigation components on that corridor. So the Alliance is really helping us identify the needs and then working with the agencies, both CPW and CDOT, to support and help apply for those grants to bring that last dollar financing to projects.
Awesome. Thanks, Tony. And Aaron, I know Tony touched on the US 160, 150, State Highway 151 project. Anything else that you would add as far as the Alliance's role in bringing that partnership together? Well,
yeah, maybe I can just add a little bit more to that. You know, folks that are on the steering committee, that are on technical teams, of course, these aren't our primary jobs. We've all got a lot going on. And so what was really great about getting the Alliance involvement, you know, when those grants come around, a lot of us, like I said, we've got other things going on and we don't realize maybe that some of these opportunities are out there or what their timelines are. And so having, you know, the Alliance step in and be like, all right, this grant is coming up, sort of pointing you and you, we need something from you to help get these grant applications in, letters of support, things like that. And so, you know, it's really helpful to, you know, have you guys facilitating that and kind of getting that done. And again, like I said, you know, for this project in our local area, that's a substantial amount of money that we may have not tapped into just because, you know, our jobs are taking us in so many other directions. So, but, you know, I think others have said it, but just the communication and essentially in the room, so to speak, with state agencies and NGOs, and we've got the tribe, and it's just a really fantastic forum. And communication's everything, you know, getting people together and talking, you get a lot done. So, yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, Aaron. We just have a couple minutes left before we want to wrap up and also tease our upcoming webinars a little bit. But one final question that I have for you all is, what advice would you give to other states, entities looking to create collaborative partnerships such as similar to the Alliance? And I'll leave it open for anyone who wants to jump in.
This is Tony, I'll jump in. I think, you know, having a group like CDR help deliver an initiative like this is really essential. Having, as Aaron mentioned, having a job that takes up 99% of my time outside of the Alliance or working on wildlife, having a group help bring all the agency and stakeholder groups together to have those conversations, to effectively run meetings and facilitate meetings, to help us work on grants. I think that's been essential for us moving forward. And finding good groups to help facilitate an effort like this, I think is really important and something that I'd recommend any group who wants to develop an alliance like this. And you know, part of the stumbling blocks with an initiative like this is funding. You know, how do we pay for the time for a facilitation group to help us kind of shepherd things along and move things through the process? And that's always an issue with, you know, all state agencies. I think we're all underfunded. And so coming up with, you know, a reasonable way of funding things for a statewide initiative is always difficult and something we struggle with on an annual basis, but hopefully something that will resolve in the next couple of years. But developing a group like this, I think one of the first things you'd need to figure out is how you would fund it for more than just a year. You'd want to fund it for several years because it takes a while to get some steam behind the effort and to get things rolling, as we've seen with our group. It's, you know, the first year was us trying to figure out who we were and what we were trying to accomplish. And then it took a year to get through those processes. And then after that, we really started making headway on our action plan.
Thanks, Tony. And you know, to speak from CDR's perspective, these are all such wonderful people to work with. So we really enjoy working with the Alliance and with all of the panelists here today. One question in the chat as a follow-up to that, has there been any pushback or opponents to this collaborative effort by the Alliance? And I don't know, Tony, maybe I'll ask you, and then Andy, if you all have perspective from the CDOT or CPW perspective, if there has been any pushback.
No, on the contrary, I think, you know, CDOT is directed by a set of transportation commissioners. They're like our board of directors, and CPW is the same way. And we've presented to both of those boards on multiple occasions, and they are in whole support of what we do. They recognize the need in Colorado for a group like this to help the state move forward on a collaborative vision for addressing these issues, and they're fully behind it. And when we talk about it with the public, I think everyone recognizes how important this type of work is, and we've heard nothing but praise for the efforts that we've undertaken with the Alliance.
Yeah, and I'll add to that in the work that we do there's almost always trade-offs in terms of public perceptions of what people want, and we're managing for the public. And so there's almost always trade-offs. And this is probably the only arena that I work in my job that there aren't those trade-offs. It seems to me like it's really a positive synergy. I think we really are working on the same missions. And I don't see that. To answer the short answer is no, I don't see the pushback on this. I think everybody wants to be able to get where they're going safely and quickly without having to drive slow and all that. And everybody wants wildlife to have connected habitats and have robust herds that we're accustomed to. And I guess the last thing I'll say is to answer the previous question of advice. I would bring your leadership teams and boards and commissions in early in the formation of this, so that they have buy-in and they know what you're up to. That way you're well supported, both from they understand what's happening, and also they can identify staff positions that will be involved.
Thanks, Andy. And Julia, I see you have your hand up. Julia's been supporting us in the chat. So I appreciate all of your efforts. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to add in that, among the public and other groups and nonprofits, I think we've seen a lot of support. And the only thing that I've seen as a real challenge from those folks that I've heard is just how to be involved more, and how to, what is the link between local efforts and the Alliance, and how can we support each other? And I think my response to that is we're still working on it. We're still trying to figure out some of the best ways that we can coordinate. I think the last couple of years, we've just been trying to establish this partnership and give ourselves some focal areas to work on. And so it's a bit of a journey. We're certainly open to ideas and suggestions as well. But I think, we really want to have that connection with other local efforts outside of the agencies, but also please be patient with us.
And Julia, while I have you, you read my mind. This really gets at kind of our next couple of webinars. Julia's been fielding a number of questions about the West Slope Wildlife Prioritization Study, as well as the East Slope, both of which we'll talk about next month at our webinar. So Julia, if you might just tease what we'll talk about a little bit next month.
Yes, so we want to talk about as I said, the Western Slope Wildlife Prioritization Study, which that process, it was started by CDOT and CPW as a part of this collaborative effort, and just recognizing that we wanted to be able to look at where to invest in wildlife mitigation more proactively rather than reactively when there's an upcoming project, that kind of thing. Those are great opportunities to tie in wildlife mitigation, but we wanted to be able to also really have a better grip on where mitigation investments would have the greatest impact, both on reducing wildlife vehicle collisions and on improving wildlife connectivity. So what we want to do at this webinar is give you a good overview of the approach that we use to identifying and prioritizing highway segments, as well as all of the supplementary tools that we created to help the decision-making process, to help with the implementation of mitigation projects, because of course there's a lot of feasibility and constructability concerns that come in as well. So we're gonna, we're still working on some of the formation of the webinar, but we'll have panelists also discuss how we're using the results of the studies and to implement projects across the Western Slope, but also how we've expanded it now to the Eastern Slope and Plains, so that we will have a statewide prioritization at the end of the day to work with.
Perfect. Thanks, Julia. We're excited for that next month, April 22nd. Again, same time, so 11 to 12:30. And we hope that you all can join to talk a little bit more in detail about that study and prioritizing areas for wildlife highway mitigation in Colorado. And then our third webinar, which Julia teased as well, maybe unknowingly, But she talked about how to get involved with wildlife and transportation issues in Colorado, and really, what are the tools? How do we work with the Alliance? What does that look like? And so that webinar, we'll talk more about that and be a little bit more interactive around that conversation, will be Thursday, May 27th. Again, from 11 to 12:30. So go ahead and put it on your calendars. Registration will be distributed soon. And let's see, I have a chat, but I can't see it. Yeah, so if there are any additional questions, thoughts, please feel free to reach out to us. Our team really appreciates you all and joining us today. And we also want to just say a quick thank you to our collaborator, Pew Charitable Trust. They've been really wonderful in supporting this webinar series. And we look forward to talking with you all again in April. So be on the lookout for that registration here in the coming week or so. And thank you so much.